Welcome back as we examine the John Goodman trial here. Criminal defense attorney and former judge Ada Pozo is with us right now. And Ada, thank you for being with us. I have to say, one of the most, I guess I would call it salacious and maybe unbelievable aspects of this case is the fact that as the trial was beginning, John Goodman filed papers to adopt his 42-year-old girlfriend. So out of the gate, I just have to say, we know that it's legal, but how do you legally adopt anyone over 18, really, when at that point they're considered an adult?
I mean, it's legal. There's no law that says somebody can't be adopted after a certain age. And a lot of people I know had the question of, well, it's his girlfriend, so if he's having sexual relations with her, is it incest because it's now his daughter? And because they are not blood relatives, in fact, it's not considered incest. So the adoption is perfectly legal, and he still continues to be able to have a relationship, a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with her, as odd as that may sound.
Okay, how can you give us an example of a case where somebody adopted an older adult, when an adult adopted another adult, and it made sense? Because this still doesn't make it still doesn't make sense to people. Why, other than financial protection or something, why would that be necessary?
In this particular case, there's no way to make sense about it. There just isn't, other than obviously he's trying to protect his assets and trying to have access to the assets, which his two biological children are obviously having a problem with, and they're fighting this in another court. But in a case where you do see adult adoptions that do make sense, or for example, in a stepchild that's been raised by a step-parent who was never legally adopted as a minor, but now the step-parent is older, and the step-parent wants to make sure that this child that they've really raised and they consider them as their child has the right when they're older to perhaps make end-of-life decisions or to inherit from them. So that adoption makes sense when it's an adoption of an adult. That would be one particular circumstance where we do see it. But in this case, I don't think there's any way, Christy, to make sense about it, other than he's obviously just trying to protect his money and have access to it.
Okay, and thank you for that. That was a great explanation. So now at least we understand the whole, why there might be, you know, some reasons to legally want to adopt an adult. So as I understand it, by adopting her, Miss Colby, Goodman guaranteed that she would have immediate access to her third of the trust. So since this child, or you know, of her, since Miss Colby is his girlfriend, does that mean that he essentially would have access to that money himself through her? Like she's the conduit?
I mean, essentially, that's his hope. Now, obviously, there's a lot of trust here that he has put in her, because when we're talking about an adoption, there's obviously no prenup situation here. There's no protection if she decides to turn on him. And from what I understand, they had not been together all that long. This is a girlfriend. This is a relationship of merely a couple of years. But his hope in adopting her is that, you're right, because she's over the age of 35, which is what the trust in his particular situation called for, she's 42 years old is my understanding, then she would have immediate access to the third, which is a mere $100 million in this case. And he's thinking that by her having access to it, then obviously he's going to have access to it for his lawyers, for whatever it is he may need if he runs out of the money that he has right now.
That's the other thing I just wanted to clarify, because when I was looking at the risks, I suppose, that we would see, the surface risks in filing papers like this, we thought, man, he's got a lot of faith in this woman, because she could, if she wanted to, once this is done, and if it is done and she is adopted by him, she could just walk off with that $100 million if she wanted to, couldn't she?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, he's legally adopted her. She's legally now his child, and as such, she's entitled to a third of that trust. He can't turn around now and say, well, that's not really what I meant. I mean, this is what he chose to do. This is what apparently his lawyers must have advised him to do, to have access to that money. And he's putting a heck of a lot of faith in the fact that she's going to stick around and she's going to let him have access to those $100 million.
And you mentioned, and we know that his true biological children have an issue with this, obviously. I think they're in their teens right now. But it cut their inheritance of this trust from $150 million apiece to $100 apiece. So they have, you know, they're fighting this. I know that's still pending, that nothing's been decided in that regard, but how do you see this playing itself out?
I mean, Right now, it's in a legal limbo in the sense, like you mentioned, that they are trying to fight the adoption, and they're going to have to prove that there was some sort of fraudulent intent in this adoption. I think it's a legal, legal place that courts haven't really addressed before. I think this is a novel issue, and I think the courts are going to have a hard time striking down this adoption. If he's saying, look, I want to validly adopt her, my understanding is that in Delaware, the state where this is, that's enough. It's not as if in other states where there is required that you have to have a parent-child relationship. You have to show that that exists. My understanding is that that's not the case in Delaware, which is where this adoption battle is taking place right now.
Why Delaware?
I believe that that may be where his children are from or where the trust was established. I'm not quite sure because obviously Mr. Goodman has resided in Florida for a long time, and I believe that the girlfriend is from Georgia as well, but I don't know why it is taking place in Delaware, quite frankly.
Well, and you mentioned that they would have to prove some sort of fraud. Do you see any place in this whole debacle where that could be proven? What would they need specifically, I guess, to prove fraud?
I mean, the kids, I'm sure, have a powerhouse of attorneys here, the two biological children, because when I say the kids, obviously, I'm not referring to her, I'm referring to his two biological children. And they're going to have to prove that the only reason that he did this adoption was so he could have access to the money. That it wasn't really for her benefit in order to adopt her so that she could be a beneficiary to the trust, but that it was actually to circumvent the law and for him to have the money. That, in fact, it was a fraud, that he really didn't intend to adopt her, for her to have access to this money, or for her to be his legal, quote-unquote, child.
Well, it sounds like a valid argument.
It's a very good argument, but, you know, like I said, I think this is a novel argument, and adoption it's such a sacred thing, and quite honestly, from a personal perspective, I think that this just cheapens the whole thing. I mean,
it has to be offensive, I would think, to some people. It is offensive.
I really believe it is, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some change in the adoption laws that stem from all the publicity in this case, and from people realizing, wait a minute, this can be done, this is wrong, and that we do see changes in the laws in several states.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Ada Pozo, Ada is sticking with us. We have some more to talk with her about in the next hour. Thank you so much, Ada. Good to have you here. Now, thanks. After John